will be discussing about the transfer of property rights. We will be just having an introductory class, like we will be reading about the basic about transfer of property rights, why transfer of property act came into force, what was the need of it, what is the definition of property, and then we will be having a brief overview about the Transfer of Property Act, how it is divided and what exactly the act deals about. Okay, so let's start. First, it's very important to know what is the definition of property, because the Transfer of Property Act basically deals with the transfer of property. So it is very important to know what exactly do we mean by property. So do you have any idea what does property mean?
No, sir.
Okay, fine. Uh, Yes. So basically, whenever we study an act, everything is defined in the act. But it is very strange that in the Transfer of Property Act, the term property has not been defined. However, in order to get a proper definition or an idea about what property exactly means, we have to go to different other acts to understand the meaning of property. The first act which I will be talking about is Section 2C of the Benami Transactions Prohibition Act of 1988. In that act, Section 2C defines property as property of any kind, whether movable or immovable, tangible or intangible, and includes any right or interest in such property. So basically, this section just gave an idea what exactly property includes. It may be movable, it may be immovable, it may be tangible or intangible, but there has been no particular definition of it which has been provided by this act. Then we come to the next act, that is the Sales of Goods Act 1930. Here, property has been defined as property means the general property in goods and not merely a special property. So here also we don't find an exclusive or an exhaustive definition of property. These are just, they are given the inclusive part, what exactly property includes. But so basically, if we follow these two definitions that are provided, then we can just classify property into four categories: movable properties, immovable properties, tangible properties, and intangible properties. So, but still, we are not aware about the definition of property. So, basically, property means a bundle of rights. Why do I say that property means a bundle of rights? Is that, see, when we talk about property, what does that mean? Be it a movable, immovable, tangible, or intangible, it means our asset which we have in our possession. For example, say the house where you live in, that is your property, that is under your possession, that is your asset. So how come these are bundle of rights? See, when you have a property, or for example, say a house, you have constructed a house and you are living there. So right now you have the right over that house because it is your property. You can rent that house, you can lease that house, you can mortgage that house. No one is going to stop you because it is in your name. So property is nothing but a bundle of rights that gets to you because of that asset which you have. So in simple terms, property means a bundle of rights. So now, as we read in these two acts, property are divided into four types: the movable, immovable, tangible, and intangible. Do you know what does tangible and intangible mean?
Sir, tangible means the things that we can see and we can feel.
Okay, right. And intangible are the ones which we cannot see or feel.
Which we can see and we can feel.
Yeah, right. So right now we are not going to deal with tangible and intangible properties, because tangible and intangible are basically, in IPR we are going to classify that, because tangible properties are all the land and everything that we can see, feel, but intangible are intellect property, that is intangible, but that is our asset, that is our property. So but when we talk about the transfer of property and the Transfer of Property Act, basically we are talking about movable property and immovable property. So in general sense, if we discuss that, yes, we have an idea what is a movable property, any property which we can move, and immovable one is which cannot be moved. But being a student of law and discussing about an act, we need to know about the definition of movable and immovable property as per law or as per the act. Now again, when we come to the movable property, it is also not defined in the Transfer of Property Act. However, again, there are various other acts from where we could get the definition or get an idea about what movable property is. Like the General Clauses Act, Section 3, Subclause 36, it talks that a movable property is the property of every description except immovable property. So it just stated that the properties which are not immovable, those are movable properties. Then coming to the Registration Act, it says that Section 2, it says that movable properties include,
Sir,
yes.
so what does that every description means?
Every description means every property or everything that is around us. Like for example, we have a land, that is a description, right? But except immovable properties. For example, I have a pen. So it is a pen, it is a description. I can write with it, I have that. But uh, it doesn't clearly define that what exactly is that. It just said that it means property of every description, whatever we can describe or whatever the property we possess and we can describe it, that becomes a property, except the immovable properties. The properties which we can move, that is a movable property. And here the exact definition of property should be clear in our mind. That is a bundle of rights, like whatever thing which we can describe and we have a right over, that is a property, in simple terms. Is it clear?
Yes, sir. So
Okay.
can you give an example of a immovable property?
Yes, I will be coming to that, because the Transfer of Property Act is all about immovable property. We will be discussing once we understand what does movable property mean. Okay.
Okay, sir.
Okay.
Yes.
So Section 2 of the Registration Act says that uh, movable property includes standing timber, growing crops, and grass, fruit upon and juice trees. Sorry, that one I have by mistaken. There is a typo error. It's juice trees and property of every other description except immovable property. So here also it says the same thing, but here the only thing is that it says that movable properties includes standing timber, growing crops, and grass, and fruits and their juice, and the trees which bear fruits. Now, why is it that standing timber? What does standing timber means? The trees from which, or the timber which from which we get wood. We construct our houses, our doors and windows from that wood. So why is that a movable property? Now, growing crops, even like we grow wheat, we grow different kinds of vegetables. Why are those even considered as movable properties? And then we talk about grass. Why are these things called as movable properties? Now once I make you understand the definition of immovable properties, then I will be coming and letting you know why these standing timber, growing crops and grass are called as movable properties, and why not immovable properties. Okay. So now one of the best
Yes.
definition which has been provided is by IPC section 22. It says that properties include corporeal property of every description. Like, what do we mean by corporeal property? Any property which we can hold, or any tangible property, right? That means corporeal property of every description except land and things attached to the earth or permanently fastened to anything which is attached to earth. So why I said section 22 of IPC clearly defines what exactly property is because it not only says what it includes, but it also says what are not included as a movable property. So it says clearly that movable property is every property, tangible property, except the land and things that are attached to the earth. or permanently rooted or embedded into the earth. So those are not movable properties, they will be immovable properties. Now, when I come back to the the definition that is given in the Registration Act, that property includes timber, growing crops, and grass. So timber, growing crops, these are all rooted to the ground, which is attached to the ground or the land. Then why these are movable properties? See, because when we talk about timber or the wood, we grow a timber plant. You say any plant, any tree which gives us wood, from which we derive wood for construction of our doors and windows. For example, let's say shisham tree, or let's say mango tree. We use mango wood for construction of doors and windows. So those trees are usually made for cutting it down and using it for construction purposes. So once a tree is cut down, it becomes a movable property because we use it for the purpose of building doors, windows. So those are movable. So that's why standing timber is not considered as an immovable property, rather it is considered as a movable property. The same with growing crops. We plant wheat, we cultivate wheat, paddy, we cultivate all vegetables, and those are plants which are attached to earth. But what we do, we plug those plants, or we cultivate the wheat, we plug those vegetables, and we sell it. So that becomes a movable property. Same with grass and same with fruit trees. For example, we plant a mango tree. The tree itself is attached to the earth as per the definition given in IPC, that every property which of every description apart from land or things which are attached to earth are movable properties. That means the things which are attached to land or to earth, those are immovable properties. So is a tree, it is attached to land. But the thing here is that we are using the fruits. Say mango, from a mango tree we pluck the mangoes. So we can plug the fruit, move it to some other place, or we can sell it. So that is the reason these are considered as movable properties rather than immovable properties. Only these three are the exceptions: growing timber, growing crops, grass, and even fruits. Okay, is it clear? Movable property.
Yes, sir.
Okay, now coming to the next, immovable property. Now, immovable property is the only one thing that is defined in the Transfer of Property Act. Section 3 of the Act says that immovable property does not include standing timber, growing crops, or grass. As I said, uh, this section is not exhaustive. It doesn't exhaustively define what is immovable property, but it just says what immovable property doesn't include. And as we read before, movable property includes standing timber, growing crops, and grass. Here, immovable property says that it doesn't include standing timber, growing crops, and grass. Now coming to the second definition, which is given in the General Clauses Act, Section 3, Subclause 26, it says that immovable property shall include land, benefits to arise out of land, and things attached to earth or permanently fastened to anything attached to earth. So it says the same thing as Section 22 of IPC defines movable property except land and things attached to the land. So in the same way, the General Clauses Act clearly states that immovable property includes land, the benefits that arise out of land, and things that are attached to the earth. Right now, you asked me to give you an example of immovable property. Say you have a land, and on that land you build a house. So that is an immovable property. Right now, if you rent that land or lease that house, whatever benefit or whatever monthly rent you will be getting out of that house, that will be even your immovable property, because those are the benefits that are arising out of the land or the house that is attached to the earth and is permanently attached. You cannot shift your house from that land and take it to some other place. So that is your immovable property, right? That is an example of immovable property. Is it clear?
Yes, sir.
Yes. Now coming to the most exhaustive definition that has been given of immovable property is section 2 subclause 6 of the Registration Act of 1908. It says that immovable property includes land, buildings, hereditary allowances, right to ways, lights, ferries, fishes, or any other benefits to arise out of land and things attached to the earth or permanently fastened to anything which is attached to the earth, but not standing timber, growing crops, nor grass. So this definition, I said that it is the exhaustive definition because it it clearly states what immovable properties include and what it doesn't include are the exceptions to immovable properties. Like it clearly said that immovable property includes lands, the buildings on that lands, the hereditary allowances or the hereditary property or a hereditary that we get from our forefathers, the properties, the lands and everything, and the rights that we get from that, and the right to ways. For example, you have a land, you have a way from your home to the main road through that land, and that is your right to land, that is your property, no one can come and acquire it. In the same way, lights, ferries, fishes, like for example ferries, like you can park your ferries in the place, uh, and that is even your immovable property. Fishes in the sense, for example, you built a pond and you start doing fishery over there, that will be your immovable property. And other benefits that arise out of the land and things which are attached to land or the earth, except the standing timber, growing crops, and grass. So that is the reason why it is considered as the exhaustive definition of what immovable property means. Okay. Hello.
Yes, sir.
Okay. Now moving on to the next meaning of transfer of property. Now we understood what is a property, what are the different types of properties, what does movable means and immovable property means. Now coming to the next part is what do we mean by transfer of property. So basically transfer of property means a person who transfers his property to one or other another person, and
Again.
that transfer can be made in the present or in the future. It can be a future transfer or it can be made at the present, like at the instant. And the person who is making a transfer or the transfer can be between an individual, like between two persons, or between companies or association or body of individuals. And any kind of property may be transferred, be it a movable property or be it an immovable property. Movable property, you can just give it to someone. Immovable property is transferred through papers or through agreements, right? So but when we talk about the Transfer of Property Act, this is the definition of what do we mean by transfer of property. But when we specifically come to the Transfer of Property Act, then Transfer of Property Act only deals with transfer of immovable properties, and that too by the act of the parties. What does this means? That transfer of property basically deals or prescribes the laws for the transfer of immovable properties, and to some extent a few sections of the Transfer of Property Act states about movable properties also, but basically transfer of property deals with the transfer of immovable properties, not the movable properties or any other properties. The movable properties are dealt under the Sales of Goods Act, or earlier, prior to the Sales of Goods Act, it was dealt by somewhat by the contract law, because there was contracts between two parties. Like if I want to transfer my right to my pen, if I have a pen and I want to transfer that right to someone else, I would make a contract with him and I would transfer. So that is, the movable properties are usually transferred by means of under the Contract Act or the Sales of Goods Act, while the immovable properties are basically transferred under the Transfer of Property Act. So Transfer of Property Act only governs transfer of immovable property, and that too by the act of the parties. That means that only two parties can or the owner of that property can transfer the property to someone else. The transfer of property takes place between two living persons or living bodies. A dead person cannot make a transfer of property under the Transfer of Property Act. Okay. The second point is the transfer of property doesn't deal with transfer of immovable property by testamentary instruments. What does testamentary instruments mean? One example of such instrument is will. If a person prior to dying makes a will that I want to transfer my property to some random stranger person, it cannot happen. That is not, that provision is not there in the Transfer of Property Act. If a person while dying by means of a will want to transfer his property to someone else, that will be governed by the Succession Act, Indian Succession Act, and not by the Transfer of Property Act. Am I clear? Okay. Hello? Hello?
Yes, sir.
Yes, sir.
Yeah, sorry, there were some disturbances. Okay. So, was I audible at that time? Like till what?
No, so we're
Okay.
discussing the second one.
Okay. Second one. It doesn't deal with transfer of immovable property by testamentary instruments. What does testamentary instruments mean? It means such as will. Like if a person while dying, if I am going to die and I make a will that my properties will be transferred to, say, a person named Y. So if I make that will, that won't be governed by the Transfer of Property Act. Rather, it will be governed by the Indian Succession Act. The Succession Act governs this type of transfers, but the Transfer of Property Act doesn't govern the transfer by testamentary instruments. Am I clear?
Yes, sir.
Okay. Now coming to the next question is why Transfer of Property Act? What is the need of this act? See, I found a very beautiful quote by Frederick Bastiat. He was a French economist. So he gave this quote that life, liberty, and property do not exist because men have made laws. On the contrary, it was the fact that life, liberty, and property existed beforehand that caused men to make laws in the first place. So, Transfer of Property Act came into force on the 1st of July 1882, and it was bill drafted by the Third Law Commission, which was appointed in 1861. But what was the situation prior to 1882? How was the transfer of properties governed prior to 1882? So prior to that, the law was governed or the transfers were governed by the principles of justice, equity, and good conscience. Right? So like even like since ages old, kings and kings used to be the judge. They used to decide if two persons have a dispute regarding the property, they would come to the king, they would discuss about, they will tell their problems, and on the basis of good conscience, equity, and justice, the person used to give a judgment, whether be it accepted by both or not. But that was the law of the land. Thereafter, the English came, they made certain laws, but the transfer of property law was not made. So at that time, it was governed generally by the principles of the Civil Procedure Code, and because transfer of property is a civil matter, it was governed by Civil Procedure Code, and somewhat that was based on the principles of justice, equity, and good conscience. And during those times, like prior 1882, there were very little disputes regarding property because property at that time were not considered as an asset. But as time went by, the people or the authorities, they found that there was a need to have an uniform and certain law for the transfer of properties, because the on the basis of justice, equity, and good conscience, no doubt they were giving justice, but that was not uniform or that was not certain. But depends, it was depending on the cases to case, but they needed to have a codified one, a uniform one, which everyone can follow. So for that reason, the Third Law Commission, it drafted the Transfer of Property Act, and later bill, and the later on the Transfer of Property Act came into force in the 1st of July 1882. Now, right now we have the Transfer of Properties Act, uh, but how is it distributed? Like, what exactly is there in the Transfer of Property Act? So basically, the Transfer of Property Act is divided into 8 chapters consisting of 137 sections. And we will be discussing about all these in the subsequent classes one by one. Right now, I'm just giving you an overview about the same. See, as you can see from the chart, transfer of property is divided into 8 chapters. The first chapter, section 1 to 3, discusses about the
Sir,
preliminary definitions. Yes,
sir, chart is not visible.
not visible as in.
Sir, you are not sharing the screen,
Okay,
I think.
okay, okay. I'm sorry. I'm sorry. I'm sorry. Yeah, is it visible now?
Yes, sir.
Okay. So, prior to,
Yes, sir.
okay, whatever I was talking about, I've already made the PPT presentations, and it will be uploaded in a YouTube website. You can find it over there even. Subsequently, it will be. So, as I said, here is the chart. The transfer of property is divided into 8 chapters consisting of total 137 sections. So the first chapter, it deals with the preliminary definitions like definition, scope, extent. So section 1 to 4, sorry. And today we were discussing about the movable or immovable properties, or the definitions which we were talking about. That was there in section 3. And section 3, apart from immovable properties, also defines 5 other definitions, which we will be discussing when we get into the Transfer of Property Act, start discussion about that. As today is the basic introduction, so I am not going into the definitions of all this uh, contents which are there in the Transfer of Property Act. I just gave you an overview so that you could understand that what exactly we mean by transfer of property, what is the need, what is the definition of property. So for that, now chapter 2, which consists of section 5 to 53, it talks about general principles relating to transfer of property. Now, again, this chapter is divided into 2 parts. As I said, that transfer of property deals with the transfer of immovable properties. However, there are few sections which deal with movable properties. So, this chapter is divided into 2 parts. First is transfer of movable and immovable properties, which is provided under section 5 to 37. And the next part is transfer of immovable properties, which is there from section 38 to 53A. Now, here we have discussed about transfer of properties, how movable properties is transferred, how immovable property will be transferred, what does the movable means, immovable means. Now the chapter, from chapter 3 to 8, that is from section 54 to 137, they discuss about how the transfer is to be made, how the immovable properties are to be transferred. Now, chapter 3 talks about transfer of property by means of sale, which it consists of section 54 to 57. The next, chapter 4, deals with transfer of property by means of mortgage, section 58 to section 104. Then the fifth chapter, it deals with transfer of property by means of lease, section 105 to 117. Chapter 6 about transfer by means of exchange, section 118 to 121. Seventh one is transfer by way of gift, 122 to 129. And eighth one is transfer by means of actionable claims, 130 to 137. Now, another part is, out of all these,
Sir, gift doesn't apply to Muslim.
no, the gift doesn't apply to the transfer by means of gift doesn't apply to Muslims, because that is governed by the Muslim personal law. You have heard about the term hiba in Muslim law. So Muslim law that prescribes, they have their own rules.
Yes, sir.
Yes. So that is the reason transfer of property law by means of gift doesn't apply in cases of Muslim. So chapter 7 doesn't apply to Muslims, right? Am I
Yes,
clear
sir.
about this? Okay. So today,
Yes, sir.
Today, this is
Yes,
the
yes.
till this much I will be explaining. So we explained about again. Let me refresh your minds, like because it got I was not sharing the screen. So first we talked about what is the definition of property. Then we discussed about movable properties, then immovable properties, then meaning of transfer of property and the basic ingredients or essentials of transfer of property. Then why the Transfer of Property Act was required or the need of the Transfer of Property Act, and then the distribution chart of Transfer of Property Act. So this is all which we discussed in the preliminary introductory class of transfer of property. Next class onwards, we will be going section by section. Like first, like today we discussed somewhat of section 3, but next class we will be discussing in details about section 3, all the definitions, everything. And so why subsequently we will be dealing by section and chapter by chapter. Okay, so any
Okay,
doubt,
sir.
any
Yes,
question?
sir.
Yes, yes, please.
No, no doubt, sir.
Okay.